Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along to this talk today. So my name is Harriet Mills and I'm a postdoc in the Department for Infectious Disease Epidemiology. So I study how pandemics and diseases and epidemics will spread through populations. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more about our work and about how you might start to predict how a global pandemic might spread across the world. So the Department for Infectious Disease Epidemiology covers a huge range of diseases, as you might expect. Sorry, I'm just going to wait till everyone comes in so it's not too noisy. Awesome. Thank you for coming along, guys. So I'm going to go through a couple of the diseases that we look at. So malaria is, there's a big group in the department who look at malaria. So malaria spreads in Africa and Asia. And we get a lot of funding from the Gates Foundation to look at how to prevent it. We also look at emerging diseases. So some of you might remember SARS. This is severe acute respiratory syndrome. It started spreading in about 2003 from China. And a group of people in my department were looking at how we could contain it. Foot and mouth disease. So we also look at animal diseases. So foot and mouth disease and bovine tuberculosis are also studied. Foot and mouth disease was an outbreak in about 2000 that we looked at. H1N1, so this is an example of a flu strain. So influenza strains, we have seasonal influenza that happens every year, and we also have pandemic influenza. And H1N1 was swine flu, which was a pandemic influenza. Now, most of you, I think, will have heard of Ebola that started spreading about a year and a bit ago now in West Africa. And there was a group in my department who were working with the WHO on the spread of Ebola, and I am going to talk a little bit more about that later. And another one would be HIV and AIDS. So we also look at that. And we don't have a departmental motto, but if we did, I think it would probably be this. So we are trying to keep calm and model and understand and stop epidemics. So one of the first questions that we ask when something new emerges is, how will it spread? So we want to understand where in the world this disease is going to move. So for example, we can look at something like influenza that you tend to get new strains emerging in China, for example, and understand where from China it will spread to. Or for Ebola, we were looking at where from Africa it will spread to. So an infectious disease is something that passes from person to person. So in a population, you might get one person infected, and they might start to spread it slowly around the population until more and more people become ill. If we spread an epidemic in here, for example, and this is actually a fairly good map of where you guys are sitting, maybe a little bit more to the right-hand side. So we could choose one person to be infected, maybe choose someone in the front, and then they could infect their two closest neighbours, and then their two closest neighbours, and so on, until eventually the whole room would become infected. This is a little bit worrying. Don't worry, I'm not going to spread a disease in here, and it's not going to spread that quickly either. But this is just an example of how something could spread. So, for example, at the festival today, something could spread this quickly. So we're going to use this as our first model to understand how a disease might spread through a population. So we're starting with one person on the far left, and he is our index case. And he then causes two new infections. So our index case is generation 1, and he causes two new infections in generation 2. Each of these cases then cause two new infections in generation 3, and then we keep going. So this is our first model. It's quite simple, but let's see where it takes us. So if we continued this out, so I think there's probably, 40 people in here? If we continued this out, then by generation 5, 33 people would be infected, 31 people would be infected. That's nearly the whole room. So if we just kept going, one person infects two people every time, then it would just take 5 generations for the whole room to become infected. I'm not really looking at a room, I'm looking at the whole world. So I'm going to look globally. Can anybody tell me what the global population is, roughly? 7 billion, yeah, it's about just over 7 billion now. So if I continued this, so if I assumed that every person who became infected caused 2 new infections, I want to know how long would it take, how many generations would it take for the whole world to be infected. So I've got my disease, I've got my model, and I'm going to start spreading this. And actually, it takes only 33 generations for the whole world to become infected. So that's quite quick. That's quite worrying, right? So if everything took a day, so if you became infected and you caused your 2 new infections in a day, then the whole world would be infected in just over a month. Bit worried? So why does this not happen? So there's many reasons. Maybe some of them are biological, but what I'm talking about today is about how the world is connected. So luckily, the whole world is not this big amalgam, everyone mixing with everyone else. People have particular friends, people have a contact structure, and people have certain people who they see, and certain people who they don't. And this is definitely helped by the geographical distribution around the world, right? There are countries and there are seas dividing them, so not everybody is in contact with everyone else. So we would call this a contact network. So everybody in this network that I've got up here is linked to other people by a line, and that means that they have contact with that person. And in terms of a disease, that means that that contact is enough for them to transmit that disease. So as an epidemiologist, I want to know what are the patterns in this contact network that will affect how my disease will spread. So the first thing I'm going to look at is called degree. And this is not everybody has the same number of friends or same number of contacts. And this is particularly relevant if you're looking at adults and children, because children go into school and they have lots and lots of contacts, lots of friends, and lots of people they see on an everyday basis. But adults might just sort of go to work and see their small group of friends at work and then come home again. So these 2 individuals in the network here, this guy only has 1 contact, and this guy has 5 contacts. So if this person on the right is infected, then actually his contact must have infected him, and he can't cause any more new infections because he doesn't have contact with anyone else. This guy on the left could cause some more infections. So the next thing we think about is strength. So these are all contacts that could cause infection, but some links are stronger than others. So this might mean that you are connected to your teacher, but you probably don't get as close to her as your friend. Or you're connected to your family, but maybe you're closer to your husband or something like that. So these links are different strengths, which means you have a different chance of infecting each of these people. So you might not just cause infections to everyone in your network. And the final thing that we look at is clusters. So there are strongly connected groups which can have very little contact with the outside world. So a good example of this could be like island nations or tribes or things like that. And these guys are protected. As long as the infection doesn't travel on that one weak link into that island or tribe, then those people will not become infected. They're effectively sort of a little bubble of protected area. However, if the infection does get into that area, then it could spread quite quickly. So these 3 different ideas tell us, okay, this is how the world's connected, and these might limit how the disease might spread. So I would then go, great, so I know that the world's connected, I know my contact network, so I'm going to move on and do my model. So I get my disease. I know that if I've got an infected person, they have a particular chance of infecting their neighbors, and I would call this a probability of infection, and that really varies depending on the disease. And I also know how long people are infectious for, so how much time they have to cause any new infections. And I would then go and I would get my contact network. But unfortunately, this is quite hard. So I don't know how everyone in the world is connected. It would be great if we did know that. And there are certain things that can help us. So, for example, you can use Facebook. You can go, okay, like there's this massive connection network, but actually Facebook, people don't see each other necessarily. So it's not necessarily a network of how disease could spread. So instead, I would go and I would ask someone, right, who do you know? Who do you see? Who might you pass the disease from? And they might say, I know these 3 people. And I'll go, great. So I will go and I'll find these 3 people and I'll ask them, who do you know? Who do you see? Who can I add to my network? And I would go and I would find these people and I start to build it up. But you might be noticing that this isn't particularly sustainable. This is going to be quite difficult for me to do. I mean, for a start, every person I ask needs to remember everything exactly. They need to remember who they've seen, when they've seen them. And then I need to go and find these people. And if someone says, I saw Bob last Tuesday, how am I going to find Bob? Like, he might not exist. There might be 10 Bobs. How do I know I've got the right one? And I might start to miss links, and it might not be exact. So this is quite a difficult network to work with, quite difficult to do. So some of you may have noticed, I'm on the infectious disease stall at the festival today, and we've been spreading a sticker epidemic. So some of you might have become infected with a sticker. The stickers have these nice little barcodes on them, which means that we can tag you with that sticker, we can scan that into our system, and we can tell you, okay, you're going to cause 2, 3 more infections. We can scan those stickers in, we can give you out those, and we then know we've connected you to the stickers, the infections you're going to cause. So our system can then build us this nice transmission network. So we then know who's infected who in our transmission network. There's a flaw in this, in that in real life, people don't have barcodes. So we can't just scan people in and say, oh, they infected so-and-so, and they infected, and draw up this nice transmission network. So in real life, we're missing this information. We can't get this information. And also, we're missing all of the possible connections. We're missing all of the people they might have seen and all the contacts they might have made that didn't cause an infection, which would be really important if we were considering how a disease might spread through a population. So people do this. People do this sort of, not barcodes, but people do contact tracing. So for example, in the Ebola epidemic, a lot of people, when cases came in, they would say to them, who might you have seen? Who might have caused your infection? And who might you have transmitted to? And one of the main ways they've managed to contain the Ebola epidemic is going to those people and asking them these questions and then tracing those contacts and isolating them before they can cause any more new infections. But this has been a massively intensive effort for the Ebola epidemic, and it's had a very good effect, but it still is a very difficult procedure. And what we're looking at is a global pandemic, and we can't find this information on a global level. So this is really hard to do. So instead of looking at the individual contact networks, which can be very useful on like a school level, but we're looking at global, we start to look instead at something a little bit different. We look at what we would call a travel network. So instead of each of these blobs being people, consider each of these blobs as being a town or a city or a country. And then the links between them represent movement from that town or that city or that country of people. So people are moving, so maybe people are moving by flight or by foot or by car. And this information is much, much easier to get because the people who are building the transport networks give us nice maps and give us lots of information on how many people are using these networks. So for example, you might recognize this. It's the tube map of London. So in this one, each of the stations are like the nodes of the network, the blobs in the network, and then the transport links in between them are the lines. So we know that people are moving from one place to another. And for example, the London Transport knows when people have tapped in and where people have tapped out, so we can start to find how this movement is across the network, and if a disease went to London, where it would spread. This one is on a slightly larger level, so this is train travel in the whole of the UK. It's also, again, a very useful measure. And this one is flight travel in Europe. And this is, actually, if you go to this website, so the NATS website, they've got some really cool videos. We're also showing them on our stand today, of how plane travel, how flights all around Europe fly in and out of Europe. So when you're looking, even just at this picture here, so this is a static image, you can see the UK is sort of the blob in the middle to the left, and then you can see Paris and Amsterdam and Holland, all these hubs where there's lots of planes going into and planes coming out of. And on a global level, flight transport data is also available. So this map here, the color of the line indicates the number of passengers flying between that place, flying between those places. So if it's more towards the pale end of the spectrum, it's got more passengers flying on it. So you can see there's lots and lots of travel within the US, for example, and there's lots of travel between the US and Europe. You can also see strong lines there. So this data is, so why is travel important? So some of you may have heard or studied in school, for example, the Black Death. So the Black Death happens in the 1300s, and it started in China. And then it traveled via the Silk Road all the way through into southeastern Europe, so into Turkey. And then it came up very, very slowly up through Europe. So these lines, the dark red is where it started in 1347. And then the next red line is where it was in December 1347. And gradually it moved in this wave all the way across Europe. But it took 3 years to do this. It took 3 years to travel just from the bottom corner of Europe up to the top of Europe in the 1300s. However, skip forward to 2009, we've got swine flu, H1N1, and this started in Mexico. And this map is how it looked after 3 months. So it started in March. This is how it looked in May. The red countries are those that are infected. And it jumped from one continent to another really, really quickly. And this is because people travel by plane. And ill people traveled by plane and took the infection to all of these countries and caused new infections. And actually, this increase in travel has been really, really recent. So you can actually look sort of 3-4 generations back, look at your grandparents, and find out how much they traveled. And actually, it's really quite small compared to people of today. We are much more global travelers of the world, as it were, and we travel globally just really, really easily. Whereas sort of 100, even 50 years ago, it was much, much harder to make these long-distance journeys, much more expensive, much more time-consuming. People didn't do it so much. But now, the real worry is that if something like this emerges again, it could spread this quickly, particularly something as infectious and easily infectious as swine flu. So, global travel in models is really important, and this is the sort of thing that we will be working on. So we have our disease, we have our probability of infection, and we have how long people are ill for, and we know how people travel. So if something emerges in China, for example, for example, they've actually had a very recent strain of bird flu, H7N9 emerged in China. Luckily, it wasn't that infectious. They also have had SARS really recently, has emerged in China. Where is it going to go? Where is it going to go, and how quickly is it going to get to these places? So this is relevant to the Ebola epidemic. I've been lucky to be part of a group at Imperial College who've been working really closely with the WHO, working on the Ebola epidemic. So we've been getting all of the data from the WHO on the cases in the country. With that data, we've been able to work out who's infected, where the infections are, how people are getting infected, what their risks are, if they've been having contact with certain people, if they've been behaving in a certain way, and also sort of what their symptoms are and how their illness has been evolving over time. So the Ebola epidemic started, well, they think it started, from bats. So Ebola is a zoonosis, which means that it is passed from animals to humans. There are lots of examples of zoonoses. So influenza are also zoonoses, and SARS was also a zoonosis. So it comes from an animal into a human. And Ebola came from bats, they think, this time round. And they know this because they traveled to the village where the very first case was. So this is the village. It's called Maliandu, that one there. This is the village. And this is the tree where they went to. Now, the very first case of Ebola was a 2-year-old boy, and he used to play in this tree with his friends. And they went to this tree, and they found traces of bats and traces of Ebola. So they think that the bats were carrying the Ebola, and they transmitted it to this 2-year-old boy. And this boy then became ill, and he then died. But this village then became the epicenter of the very first case. And there were lots and lots of cases in this village. Now, this village is here in Guinea. And this country, this is Liberia, and this darker bit here is Sierra Leone. So you can see that this village was right in the middle of all of these 3 countries. It was right in the center. This is a bigger map of West Africa. So this is Sierra Leone here, this is Liberia here, this is Guinea, coming around them both, and this red arrow is pointing to where that village is. So you can see this is actually a map taken from earlier this week. The darker blue the colours are the more cases that are in those regions, in those countries. So you may have heard yesterday Liberia just declared itself Ebola-free, but Guinea and Sierra Leone are still going. They've still got a certain number of cases a week. I think we're at sort of 20 or so, 20 to 50 a week at the moment. But what's interesting is that this very first case came right in the middle here. And then it spread in this wave out. And it particularly jumped to the hotspots. So this is a city, and these are cities here. And that's where there were huge numbers of cases. So what people did when Ebola first emerged was look at the global travel routes from West Africa to the rest of the world. So this map here is, this is Africa here, and this is West Africa. So these are where these three countries are. So Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea are in this orange blob here. And they started to look at where the flight routes are, where they're going out from these countries. And they then calculated the probability of importing a case, so taking a case from these countries into new countries, to work out what countries should be on the lookout, or what countries should be on the alert for Ebola cases being imported. And they found that there were very strong links, as you might expect, between other countries in West Africa, but they also predicted a strong link between those countries and the US and those countries in the UK. And this meant that these countries were on alert. Now, actually, what happened with Ebola is that not many cases did get exported. Not many cases did end up in these countries. So the US did have about 5 or 6 cases, and the UK had 3 or 4, but they were all healthcare workers returning to the UK. Spain also had a couple. So this map here, the red countries are the 3 that are most infected, Guinea and Liberia and Sierra Leone. And this is Mali, this orange one here, and that had a very small number of cases. I think it was under 20. Nigeria had 20 cases, but it managed to contain it really, really quickly. But we had cases jumping to the US and the UK and Spain and the UK. But what this model showed us is which countries we should be on the alert in. And it also showed us what could happen if we didn't start to screen at airports and if we didn't start to pay a bit more attention to who was getting on the planes. Basically, it made people aware of what could happen and what the worst case scenario could be. And while this model actually isn't what actually happened in real life, it really helped people to prepare for what could happen and stopped it actually happening. So another good example is SARS. So SARS was in 2003. It stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome. It's actually what's called a coronavirus, which is very similar to flu, but it's a different type. So these guys actually used this data, so this graph I showed you earlier, to predict where SARS, which started in China, would spread to. And this map on the bottom here is where they predicted it would spread to. So they predicted a large number of cases in the US and Canada, no cases, the green is where there's no cases, some cases in Russia, some cases in Australia. And this is what actually happened. So they were really, really close to what actually happened. And they were able to do this entirely from this flight data. So this is basically just showing you how well connected the world is today and why people are so worried about diseases and epidemics like this. And I just really like this graph. It really shows how important air travel is. So this is a map of a plane for SARS. And this was a flight that flew between Beijing and Hong Kong, which is about a 4-hour flight, during the middle of the SARS epidemic. This guy here, this red cross, he was an infected case, the index patient on this flight. And he caused all of these red infections on this one flight. Now, because this plane was flying into Hong Kong, quite a lot of these people were business travelers. So they then went on to other countries. And actually, they traced all of these people and found how many different countries they went to and how many new mini epidemics and mini outbreaks they caused, just because this one guy got on this flight when he was infectious. So this is really important, so whether you should screen people before they get on flights and things like that. So not only do these models predict where it's going to go, but we can also use them to predict what sort of interventions we should do. So with Ebola, there's been worries about whether we should quarantine people, whether we should isolate people. When I traveled to Hong Kong last year, there was border control. So when you come through Hong Kong airport, they scan your temperature to check that you are well. There was worries whether we should do that in the UK. There's also worries about whether we should actually stop flights altogether. So with SARS, for example, They were trying to decide whether they should actually close down airports, and in the end they did close some down, and it did stop the epidemic. But it's got a massive impact if you do that. You're stopping people traveling. It's got a huge economic impact. So they try not to do that if they can. And then this picture I really like. So this was actually from the height, I think, of the SARS epidemic. And it really shows how information spreads. He's on the phone whilst wearing a face mask. So he's talking to his friend about the disease. And it's just really important because actually people are connected globally. So it's not just within country that people are talking to each other. They're also talking globally and causing people to stop traveling globally, which can be really important for stopping disease spread. So the next epidemic, obviously I can't tell you what it is because we don't know yet. But when one emerges, what our group is trying to do is to work out where and how it will spread and how can we stop it. And those are the two most important things so that we can be prepared and we can act really quickly. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry, that was probably quite quick. But if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to talk about anything. Yes, this side.
Yeah, so you talked about social networks.
Yes.
And, well, actually also, I guess Android can be deemed a social network. And Android collects a lot of GPS data. Facebook does too. LinkedIn is starting.
Yep.
Are you collaborating with any of them?
So this interesting question, actually. So I've been talking to quite a few people about collecting mobile phone data. But the problem with mobile phones and with Facebook and with LinkedIn is that they don't want to share it. So they really, really don't like sharing it. So there are a couple of mobile phone companies that do collaborate with people. I think the ones I've heard about are in Brazil. But Facebook in particular doesn't like sharing its social networks. And LinkedIn I don't know about. But people know that this data is really important. So getting people to give it up to people to us who will then use it is actually quite hard. It's quite difficult to persuade people to do that. But yeah, it would be incredibly useful, particularly mobile phone data. You think? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was interesting, very interesting. Particularly the initial network analysis you were performing on the social network to see how the epidemic could spread inside a city. I know was full of assumption, but was also necessary.
Yeah.
But then you decided that moving to the flight connections could be better because you have a sort of perfect information about the traveling.
Yeah.
And it makes sense, but I was wondering if the two problems are not so strongly connected, that you are making exactly the same mistake that you were doing in the social network analysis. Because if I want to understand how the epidemic will spread through flight connection, I will look for the probability to export this connected to the probability that the passenger will have the disease. And this is always nested to the previous problem that we had in determining how many people have the disease inside the country.
Yeah.
So I think the mistake that you make in the forecast of the probability is proportional to the mistake that you made in the social network to forecast the probability itself. So we didn't solve the initial problem.
So there, I guess, with every model, no model is perfect.
Absolutely.
Right? Absolutely no model is perfect. But the global flight pattern data has been shown to be a very, very effective way of predicting where something will spread. Obviously, if you want to go down to, you're never going to predict the exact number of cases by using that data because of exactly that question, that you still don't have the individual level data, you still don't have the individual networks, but it's a good predictor of the probability of something jumping from one country to another. So I think I would just say models are not perfect, and you have to make assumptions somewhere, and you have to decide your trade-off in accuracy and in the information that you can actually get hold of. Which one will provide you with the information that you need in a very short time period. You know, when the Ebola emerged, we have no data on how people move inside those countries. We just don't know anything about it. Even the mapping in those countries is low.
This probability, are you just looking at the number of people that are traveling?
Yeah,
Make an assumption also about the possibility that these people have a disease or not. Just very curious from
Sorry, what was the
model
second bit?
point of view.
What was the second? The number of people who are traveling
Are
and
you just looking at the number of people, or you're looking also at the probability that these people have already disease?
Oh yeah, so you're also looking at the probability that they're already infected. You tend to have within country models, and then those who are infected in those countries, they have a probability of traveling and actually moving with their infection somewhere else as well. So you have two levels to the model, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Looking at the passenger flow, can you see that the temperature check in Hong Kong makes a difference?
So this is an interesting question, actually. So there's lots of information on whether you should screen or not, because the number of passengers that you will actually catch is quite low, and any infections caused on the plane, you're not going to pick. They're not going to develop a fever by the time they land. So there's a lot of debate around whether it's actually worth doing any screening at all because of the low numbers of people who you're actually going to catch. It's a very good question. There's a lot of models about it. And actually, the latest model I saw said that you're going to catch so few people, it's almost not worth it, because people just won't develop an illness, and people who are ill won't even travel anyway.
Are countries quite forthcoming with the data of outbreaks within them? Or will they hang on to it because they're worried about people travelling there?
This is another interesting question. So China's a good example. So when SARS happened in 2003, they were very unwilling to share the information, and actually they hid the epidemic for quite a long time. Perhaps not hid, but didn't give out the data that would have really helped, which is almost why it spread so much. But there are now regulations in place, and also China has very much changed its attitude and is much more forthcoming giving out that information. So that they're much, much better at sharing case data. And actually, even as a non-academic, you can find all this information online now. They release it in the news, and they release it on their Ministry of Health, and do share it with the world because they're aware of how much difference it makes to have that information quickly and accurately. Yeah.
Animals. How long, for example, in Ebola, would the disease have been among the bats, and how did it develop in the bats in the first place?
So Ebola was actually first discovered in 1976 in Africa, and there have been, I think it's under 20, maybe 14, 15 outbreaks of Ebola in that time, but the biggest one of those was 300 cases. And they think that it spreads in bats, but they have never really confirmed this. It's definitely still a hypothesis. However, they have found that gorillas and chimpanzees and monkeys can get Ebola. So they have found it in them, but they don't think that those are... They think that if you eat the meat, you might get Ebola, but these links are... So it's very difficult to trace back to the original cases for Ebola because people die so quickly. So they think it's bats, and they think since 1976, but these things are still up in the air.
How many of the diseases that you've talked about do you think have been cured by quarantine and screening and medicine, as opposed to people building up a general resistance? Does that exist? I mean, they seem to have come and gone quite quickly, relatively speaking, to a lot of common diseases. Yeah.
So, for example, influenza, people do have an immunity to it. And you will find that if the same strain emerges 30 years later, people who had it 30 years before, or even were in the population 30 years before, will have an immunity to it. But for pandemics and things like for Ebola, actually that really has been contained by contact tracing and by isolation and by medicine, because the people people don't build up a resistance to something that bad, basically. So I don't know how many, but I would say that the majority of pandemics are contained by human interaction, so by isolation and by treatment and by contact tracing, definitely. Yes.
First of all, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. And but I'm really new about this one, and I'm only here because I played this game. I'm not sure it's called Plague Inc.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah. So basically, the objective is to wipe out the entire human race.
Yep.
Through your own
great fun.
Disease, okay. Right? So I found out that I had a high chance of winning if I started my, created disease in a troubled country, in a certain threat, in a poor area. Yeah. I would say. And I was wondering if in the model that you have, do you have like specific? Do countries have like specific threat levels? Do you count like do do countries have specific threat levels? And if so, what are the factors that you would rank them?
So this is actually good to relate back to Ebola again. It's the number of healthcare workers in those countries is really low. And definitely when you're looking at a global disease, and you're comparing how well countries can contain any disease, looking at their healthcare resources and at their healthcare infrastructure is really important. And I'm assuming plague takes that into account, though I haven't ever played it, I'm afraid. But you definitely see that if a disease emerges in a country that doesn't have that infrastructure, that it will spread much more quickly and be much more devastating, and therefore you should always be building that into a model if you're doing that. But you will also find that those countries will have different flight patterns and different types of people will be traveling, and all of these things will go into a model in as much detail as you can. The trouble is if you start putting all of this into the model becomes quite unwieldy, and it's quite difficult to get all of this information in a way that's effective to use. So it's definitely a trade-off between making the model run fast enough, so having enough computer power to run it with all these extra parameters and extra things, and having enough detail that you're representing the world in a realistic way. Is that okay? Yes. Is there one at the back? Sorry.
Yeah. Hi. I was just wondering, that photo that you showed of the passengers on the plane, it looked like it was kind of a random spread of like who had the disease by the end of it, because the people sitting next to him didn't seem to be affected.
Yeah. Let me go back to it. Yes. So this is actually quite a big area of study about how infections will spread on planes, because people look at things like so air circulation, because there is air circulation in planes. So it will never necessarily be the people who are next to you, because the air is constantly circulating, and the air is constantly changed. And so this is why they think it spread this far in this one, is because because the air was constantly circulating. The other thing to note with this one is, and I don't know if you can see this from the back, but they didn't interview everyone. So if they've got, if the circle looks like this, so it's a circle with a line through it, then they've got no illness and the person was interviewed. But actually, the people who are closest to him, they didn't manage to interview them. So they've got no illness, but the person wasn't interviewed. And with SARS, there was quite a big range of whether it was whether they were very infectious, whether they were very ill, and whether they weren't. So it may well be that he did pass it on to them, but they had a level of immunity, or they just didn't get it as well, so they didn't report an illness. But there have been a lot of studies particularly looking at TB and whether that will transmit, but actually you need to be next to someone for quite a long period of time for TB. So they kind of look at how long you need to spend next to someone to determine the probability, but it's quite difficult on planes because of the air circulation. Sorry, I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Have any species died out because of viruses or bacteria before?
Well, that's a good question. There's definitely been. I don't know definitely the answer. There definitely has been, but I'm not sure about the answer to that question. So there's definitely been like trees and bugs and things, but I'm not sure about any animals that have died out. But I expect that is the case, because animals do get diseases exactly the same as us, as we've seen with Ebola. And also, so gorillas get Ebola, they also get HIV. So they do get diseases just as bad as we do, and it definitely will be causing eradication of those animals. Sorry, I can't answer it better than that. There, any more questions?
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. We know that the problem is now worldwide, and it can spread very quickly. Are the governments, all over the world, have action in place in case of disease spreading like that?
So, sorry, could you repeat the question? Are there any actions in case of a disease spreading?
Yes, is there a global plan, if to stop?
Yeah. So the World Health Organization, along with other organizations, does have plans in place for what it would do, and it will act on them, but it will have to. So the problem with many diseases is recognizing the disease in time. So whether the country can release the information quickly enough in order to put those plans in place and contain it well enough. is one of the problems. And recognizing, diagnosing, and assessing the situation and whether you need to put those plans in place, because quite often those plans can be quite devastating to the countries involved. So, for example, if you're shutting down air networks, that can be really economically devastating to that country. You can stop people flying in, it can stop tourism, it can stop any business things. So they do have plans, but they are wary to put them in place until they're definitely sure that it's a big enough threat to have these massive plans in place. They'll also have plans on, so for example, pandemic and seasonal influenza, there are plans made every year about what vaccine they're going to give out, who they're going to vaccinate, what would happen if something took over, what would happen if something nasty emerged. But for more infectious diseases like Ebola, it's much more situational on how they assess what their response is going to be. Is that okay? Yes?
Just last question. Do you have numbers, like how many cases you should have to consider pandemics started, or for each country or for all over the world?
I don't think there are numbers. It's more the impact it's having. So how fast and how, if it's infected a whole community, is it called an epidemic? And then how fast it's spreading across the world if it's called a pandemic. So it's not so much numbers. It's more just an assessment of how widely it's spread and how quickly. Okay.